life in February of 1880 had already demonstrated that those threats were not theoretical. The emperor's response to this environment had been, from the perspective of those watching with concern, to make himself and his court more internally complicated rather than less. That combination of external danger and internal disruption was, according to more than one account from the period, precisely what made the weeks following the marriage feel to those living inside it less like a resolution than like the beginning of something they could not yet fully see. The title of Princess Yuryevskaya was granted by imperial decree in the weeks following the morganatic marriage, and with it came a formal elevation of the children's status. Georgi, Olga, and the young Ekaterina now carried a recognized name, a legal position, and the documented acknowledgement of their father's identity that had been withheld from them since birth. In purely technical terms, the decree was entirely within the emperor's authority to issue. The Russian imperial system, for all its procedural complexity, reserved to the sovereign a range of personal prerogatives that included the right to formalize domestic arrangements by decree when circumstances required it. Alexander had used that authority deliberately, completely, and with the same speed that had characterized every action he took in the months following the Empress's death. The question was not whether the decree was legal. The question was what it meant for everyone who now had to live with it. Within the Romanov family, the response moved along a spectrum that surviving correspondence from the period describes with some consistency. At one end, there was cold formality, the precise, correct, and entirely hollow acknowledgement that the situation existed, expressed through channels that communicated acceptance of the legal fact while withholding any suggestion of personal acceptance of the reality behind it. At the other end, there was something that several accounts characterize with language suggesting barely managed anger. Reactions communicated through trusted intermediaries, through the register of private letters that were written with the understanding they would not be preserved, and through the behavior of individuals at court functions where the new title created unavoidable questions of precedence and acknowledgement that no one had prepared a protocol for answering. The gap between the legal reality the decree had created and the social reality the court was capable of absorbing was, in the autumn of 1880, very wide indeed. The question of precedence was not a trivial one in an institution organized entirely around rank. Princess Yuryevskaya now held a title. She held it by imperial decree. The obligations of court etiquette toward a person holding such a title were, in principle, defined. But the individuals responsible for those obligations had spent the better part of 15 years carefully managing their relationship to her existence, maintaining the precise social distance required by a situation in which she had no formal position. The title did not simply change her status. It retroactively reclassified every act of managed distance that had been performed on her behalf and created a new set of requirements that those same individuals were now expected to fulfill with apparent naturalness. Some accounts from court figures during this period describe the resulting atmosphere as one of visible and uncomfortable recalibration. People determining, day by day, exactly how much acknowledgement the new situation required and how much their own positions would bear. For the senior officials whose professional lives had been organized around the management of the dynasty's public stability, the shift carried implications that went beyond social awkwardness. These were individuals who had made specific choices across specific years, choices about what to record and what to omit, what to present and what to conceal, how to manage the relationship between the visible court and the invisible arrangements that sustained it. Their complicity in the concealment had been, in a sense, a form of institutional loyalty, a judgment that the stability of the dynasty was better served by organized silence than by any of the alternatives available. The morganatic marriage and the title that followed it didn't simply end that silence. It reframed the entire preceding period as something other than what their choices had been intended to produce. The secret they had protected had become an official reality, and an official reality of a kind that required justification rather than concealment. The position they now occupied was, in several important respects, more exposed than the one they had occupied before. Some of these officials, according to accounts that surfaced years later through memoirs and the recollections of individuals adjacent to them at the time, responded by quietly reassessing where their institutional loyalties were most durably located. The emperor was aging. The attempts on his life had become a pattern serious enough that security around him had been substantially reorganized. The heir, Alexander Alexandrovich, the future Alexander III, held views on the morganatic marriage and the new title that had been communicated through every available indirect channel with perfect clarity. The future, in other words, had a direction that was legible to anyone reading the available evidence carefully. And officials who had built their careers on reading available evidence carefully were, in the autumn of 1880, doing precisely that. There is a version of these months, drawn from several independent accounts, in which the granting of the title produced something more than social friction and institutional recalculation. According to this version, the decree accelerated a quiet but consequential fragmentation of the loyalty networks that had sustained the emperor's inner circle for years. Some individuals whose positions had been predicated on proximity to Alexander, whose access, influence, and practical authority derived from the trust he placed in them, began the slow process of hedging that loyalty against the near certainty of a future in which it would be not only valueless, but potentially compromising. This is the kind of shift that does not announce itself. It happens through the gradual redirection of attention, through the slight but measurable change in the speed and thoroughness with which information reaches those who should receive it, through the almost imperceptible loosening of the bonds that make an institution function as a coherent whole rather than a collection of individuals managing their individual futures. Whether the security failures that would become catastrophically relevant in the following months were connected to this fragmentation is a question the historical record allows but does not confirm. What the record does show is that the months between the granting of the title and the assassination of Alexander II in March of 1881 were months in which the emperor's inner circle was operating in a condition of internal displacement, adjusting to a new reality that had been imposed with speed and without consultation, recalculating loyalties in the light of a future that was increasingly visible, and managing an institution that had been organized around a secret now replaced by a formal acknowledgement that created more complications than the secret itself had done. The title that could not be accepted was not simply a social inconvenience. It was a marker of the precise moment at which the concealment that had held the court together for 15 years finally ceased to perform the function for which it had been built. Alexander Alexandrovich, the Tsarevich and heir to the Russian throne, was not a man given to ambiguity. Those who knew him during the 1870s and 1880s described a figure of considerable physical presence and equally considerable personal certainty. Someone whose views formed with conviction and remained, once formed, largely resistant to revision. He was conservative in his political instincts in ways that placed him at a measurable distance from his father's reforming temperament, and that distance was not merely ideological. It was generational, personal, and, by the time of the morganatic marriage and the granting of the Yuryevski title, freighted with a quality of accumulated tension that multiple accounts from the period describe as having become very difficult to contain within the formal registers available to a crown prince who could not openly confront a reigning emperor. The relationship between Alexander II and his heir had never been simple. Father and son disagreed on substantial matters of governance, and those disagreements had expressed themselves over the years through the kind of formal cordiality that functions in dynastic families as a precise substitute for genuine warmth. The Tsarevich had his own household, his own circle of advisors, his own developing sense of what the empire required and how it should be governed. His wife, Maria Feodorovna, the Danish princess who had become one of the most socially acute observers of the Romanov court, had her own clear assessments of the situation and communicated them through her husband and through the network of relationships she maintained with senior court figures. By the late 1870s, the household of the Tsarevich had developed into something with the character of a parallel court, a space where the dynasty's future was being quietly imagined in terms that differed from its present in several important respects. When the morganatic marriage became known within the inner circles of the family, and it became known almost immediately despite the discretion of the ceremony itself, the Tsarevich's response was, according to accounts that have survived through several indirect channels, one of controlled but unmistakable fury. He did not confront his father directly. There is no documented record of any open exchange between them on the subject that has survived in accessible form. What survived instead is the record of his reaction as it was communicated to those around him. In the register of private correspondence with Maria Feodorovna, in the accounts of individuals who moved between the two households and observed the change in atmosphere, and in the behavior of the Tsarevich himself at court occasions where the new situation created unavoidable moments of implicit acknowledgement. Several accounts describe him during this period as a man maintaining composure through visible effort. The concern that surfaced most insistently within the Tsarevich's circle during these months was not, at its core, simply a matter of personal offense or dynastic propriety. It was a concern about succession, and specifically about whether the emperor, having moved with such speed to formalize one set of arrangements, might not stop there. The morganatic marriage was legally clear on this point. Children born of such a union could not inherit the throne, and Ekaterina's new title carried no dynastic rights that could interfere with the established line of succession. The legal position was unambiguous. What was less unambiguous, according to several accounts from within the Tsarevich's circle, was whether Alexander II intended to remain within those legal boundaries or would seek to use the same instrument, imperial decree, to alter them. Whether this fear was based on concrete evidence or was, at least in part, constructed, which is, perhaps, the most honest thing that can be said about it. What the record does support is this. By the late 1860s, Ekaterina Dolgorukova had become a permanent and significant presence in the private life of the Russian emperor. Her accommodations, her access to imperial spaces, and her movements between residences were managed with a care and consistency that placed her in a category for which the court had no established name and no formal protocol. She was not a wife. She was not, in the conventional sense of the word, a mistress. She occupied something the court's institutional language had no ready description for. And that absence of language, that deliberate gap in the official vocabulary, may have been, looking back across the decades, one of the earliest signs that what had begun as a private attachment was already becoming something that would require far more than private management to contain. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg was not simply a residence. It was one of the largest inhabited buildings in the world, a structure of more than 1,500 rooms spread across multiple floors and wings, connected by corridors whose total length ran to several kilometers. It housed not merely the imperial family, but an entire working population of servants, officials, guards, and functionaries whose daily routines were coordinated with the precision of a military operation. Within such a structure, it was architecturally and logistically possible for one section of life to proceed in near complete separation from another. The palace didn't need to be reorganized to accommodate a secret. It simply needed to be managed in ways that were never written down. What historians and researchers have been able to reconstruct, working from palace records, architectural plans, surviving staff memoirs, and the occasional private letter that escaped later censorship, is a picture of methodical spatial arrangement. Ekaterina Dolgorukova's accommodations within the imperial residences were placed with a specificity that was not accidental. At the Winter Palace, her apartments were located within accessible distance of the emperor's private rooms, according to accounts pieced together from multiple sources. Close enough for unannounced movement, distant enough to require no public acknowledgement of the proximity. The arrangement was, in the language of architecture, a form of plausible separation. It created the appearance of proper distance while quietly eliminating the practical inconvenience of it. Movement between these spaces required, by the nature of palace life, the cooperation of specific individuals. A corridor cannot be kept clear at an unusual hour without someone giving instructions. A room cannot be prepared without a servant who understands the purpose of that preparation. The ordinary material requirements of occupied rooms, meals, lighting, fire, generated small, practical chains of knowledge that extended outward from whatever private understanding existed at the center. Domestic staff in households of this scale operated within extremely defined hierarchies. They were not, as a rule, people who asked questions. But they were people who observed, and several accounts from individuals who worked in the imperial residences during this period describe patterns that stood out sharply against the background of normal palace routine. Some recalled specific corridors used at hours when the official schedule accounted for no movement. Others described rooms prepared with a consistency suggesting regular habitation, while no formal assignment of those rooms appeared in the household registers. Requests were fulfilled for particular arrangements, for specific supplies, for the quiet presence or absence of certain staff, without the written authorization that ordinary palace administration demanded for even routine decisions. According to at least one memoir from a household official of the period, certain items were simply never recorded. Not lost, not forgotten. Deliberately absent from the paper trail that the palace machinery otherwise generated with considerable thoroughness. The gap itself, in institutional terms, is a form of documentation. Communications between the emperor and Ekaterina during the years when direct contact carried the highest risk of exposure were managed through a small group of trusted intermediaries. Some were household staff of long standing. Others were individuals whose connection to both parties gave them natural cover for the exchange of correspondence. The letters themselves, those that survive in any form, exist in incomplete and selectively edited condition, a circumstance that has led some historians to suggest a systematic review of the relevant correspondence took place after the emperor's death. Those responsible for managing the dynasty's reputation would have had both the motive and the opportunity to determine, with considerable care, what should remain accessible and what should not. The remarkable thing, considered carefully, is not that this machinery existed. Private arrangements within powerful households are not historically unusual. What is remarkable is how long it held.
By most serious historical estimates, the arrangement in its fully organized form functioned for somewhere between 10 and 15 years before external circumstances forced it into a more visible condition. During that time, the court continued to present its official face to Russia and to Europe without a significant public rupture. Diplomats arrived and departed. State ceremonies were conducted. The Empress appeared at functions. Whatever was understood inside the walls of the imperial residences remained, to any external observer, entirely and convincingly invisible. That invisibility required people, specific people in specific roles, making specific choices every day. And this is the question that survives in the historical record long after most other details have been settled. How many of them knew? Not suspected, not heard something from someone else, actually knew with the clarity of direct observation or direct instruction what they were being asked to maintain. Some estimates, drawn from the number of individuals whose roles would have necessarily brought them into contact with the arrangement, suggest the figure runs to several dozen at minimum. Possibly more if one includes those who understood enough to understand their silence was expected, even without having been explicitly told why. In a household of that size, full ignorance was itself a managed condition. Their silence came at a cost worth pausing to consider. Some who served in relevant roles during these years left employment in ways that were not fully documented. Others received pensions or appointments whose recorded justification is vague or entirely absent. There are no confirmed testimonies of individuals who spoke out and suffered consequences as a result. But the absence of such testimonies does not prove the silence was freely given. In institutions organized around proximity to power, the understanding of what is expected rarely needs to be spoken directly. It communicates through atmosphere, through the behavior of superiors, through the example of those who remained and those who, quietly and without explanation, did not. What the machinery of those years ultimately produced was not simply the concealment of one relationship. It produced a court accustomed at the level of institutional reflex to managing inconvenient truths. And that habit, once formed, tends to outlast the secret that created it. Maria Alexandrovna was born Princess Marie of Hesse and by Rhine in 1842 and came to Russia as a teenager to marry the Romanov heir. By all contemporary accounts, she adapted to imperial life with considerable personal discipline, learning the language, converting to orthodoxy with apparent sincerity, and settling into the demanding ceremonial existence of a Russian empress with the efficiency of someone who had understood from an early age that her life would be organized around obligation rather than preference. She bore 8 children. She maintained the public functions of her role through decades of increasing physical decline. Those who attended her closely described a woman of unusual interior self-possession, not cold, but quietly in command of whatever she felt, in a way that left very little visible on the surface. Her health had been compromised for years, a pulmonary condition that progressively reduced her endurance and made the cold damp of St. Petersburg particularly damaging. By the early 1870s, she was spending longer periods away from the capital on medical advice, appearing at court functions with diminishing frequency and with the careful presence of someone for whom public appearances had become a physical expenditure calculated against a limited reserve. Those who attended her during these years left accounts consistent in at least one respect. She was not a woman who confused diminished health with diminished perception. Her mind remained fully engaged. Her understanding of the court she had inhabited for more than 2 decades was precise and detailed, the product of years of careful, close attention to its inner workings. What she knew about her husband's private life is a question the historical record approaches with considerable caution. Surviving correspondence from the Empress during the relevant years is almost entirely formal. Letters concerned with her children's health, with charitable work she continued to direct from confinement, with the religious observances that occupied more of her attention as her physical condition worsened. If there are letters in which she addressed the situation directly, none have surfaced in any accessible archive. Some historians have taken this absence as significant in itself, the product not of ignorance, but of a deliberate choice not to create documents that would later require management. Others suggest relevant correspondence was removed at some point between her death and the later reorganization of imperial records that followed the dynasty's collapse. What does survive, in fragmentary but consistent form, are accounts from ladies-in-waiting who served the Empress during the critical years of the 1870s. Some of these accounts, preserved in memoirs and in letters that circulated within aristocratic families long after the empire ceased to exist, describe moments of quiet exchange between the Empress and those closest to her that suggest an awareness she was unwilling to express through any official channel. According to one such account, the Empress, on a particular occasion, made a remark, indirect, controlled, and delivered without apparent emotion, that those present understood as a direct acknowledgement of what she had long known and had chosen not to contest. The remark is reported differently across the sources that preserve it, but its essential substance across all versions is remarkably consistent. The decision to remain silent, if it was truly a decision rather than the path of least resistance within a structure that offered her no meaningful alternative, carried its own form of power, and those observing it from inside the court understood this clearly. An empress who spoke would have forced a confrontation with consequences no one could predict or control. An empress who remained silent created something different, a sustained, steady pressure that those around her could not ignore precisely because it was never released. Some accounts from court figures of the period suggest her composed endurance made certain household officials deeply uncomfortable, more uncomfortable in some respects than an open conflict might have done. A grievance that is never voiced cannot be resolved, dismissed, or quietly managed away. It simply remains, and it accumulates weight with every passing season of silence. Her death in June of 1880 did not produce the pause that deaths of this kind ordinarily generated within the court's social machinery. Within weeks, by some accounts within 40 days, Alexander II had moved to formalize his relationship with Ekaterina Dolgorukova in a private ceremony witnessed by only a small number of trusted figures. The speed of this action was, according to multiple sources, startling even to those who had long understood the situation. Whether the decision reflected grief transformed into urgency, a practical resolution of something long prepared, or something more difficult to characterize, the effect was immediate. What the court had spent more than a decade carefully not acknowledging had been given suddenly the most official form available. The Empress's long silence had ended. Its consequences had not. What Maria Alexandrovna's prolonged and dignified silence ultimately communicated to those watching from inside the court structure was something beyond personal suffering or personal restraint. It communicated the shape of the institution itself, its deep unwillingness to acknowledge internal contradiction, its preference for managed appearances over resolved realities, its capacity to sustain fictions indefinitely as long as the people required to sustain them continued to fulfill their roles. She had been, in this sense, as much a part of the machinery as the valets who cleared corridors at unusual hours and the officials who kept certain items off the written records. Not because she chose it freely, but because the structure she inhabited had no place for the alternative. And in that respect, her story and the story of everyone else inside those carefully maintained walls was, beneath all differences of rank and circumstance, essentially the same. The first child was born in the spring of 1872, a boy named Georgi. The circumstances of his birth were managed with the same quiet precision that had by then become the defining characteristic of everything connected to Ekaterina Dolgorukova's existence within the Imperial orbit. There was no public announcement. There was no entry in the kind of official register that recorded events of dynastic significance. There was, in the formal documentation of the Russian Imperial Court, essentially nothing. A silence so complete that it would have been entirely convincing to anyone consulting the records without prior knowledge of what they were looking for. And yet the child existed, and the emperor knew it, and a small circle of individuals whose professional lives were organized around the management of inconvenient realities knew it as well. 3 more children followed across the next 6 years. A daughter, Olga, born in 1873. A second son, Boris, born in 1876, though Boris would survive only into early childhood, a loss that those close to the emperor described as affecting him with a heaviness that he neither concealed particularly well nor discussed openly. A second daughter, Ekaterina, named for her mother, born in 1878. 4 children in 6 years, delivered into a legal and social condition for which the Russian Empire's elaborate system of rank, inheritance, and formal recognition had no prepared category. They were the children of the reigning sovereign. They were also, by every formal measure available, entirely invisible. The legal impossibility of their position was not simply a matter of sentiment or social awkwardness. In the Russia of the 1870s, a person's legal identity, their right to bear a name, to hold property, to occupy any defined position within the social structure, derived from documented status. Children born outside recognized marriage to a father who was a serving emperor existed in a condition the law had not been designed to accommodate. They could not be registered under the Romanov name. They could not be presented at court in any capacity that acknowledged who those father was. The ordinary apparatus of aristocratic life, the documents that established who a person was and what they were entitled to, was simply unavailable to them through normal channels. Their existence required, as everything connected to this situation required, a solution that worked outside the visible system. What is known about their early housing arrangements has been reconstructed from a combination of staff recollections and the partial records that survived the various reorganizations of imperial documentation over the decades following the dynasty's end. The children appear to have been maintained in accommodations that kept them physically close to the emperor without placing them in any space that required official acknowledgement. Nursery staff were drawn from a pool of household employees whose loyalty had been tested over years of service in connection with Ekaterina herself. The arrangements for their daily care, their feeding, their medical supervision, their early education, were managed through informal chains of authority that mirrored in miniature the larger machinery that had been running since the late 1860s. Effective, quiet, and almost entirely absent from the paper record. The emperor's insistence on personal presence in his children's daily lives is one of the details that recurs across multiple independent accounts from this period, and it is worth pausing on. A man in Alexander's position had almost unlimited reasons, practical and institutional, to maintain careful distance from children whose existence he could not officially acknowledge. Every visit, every personal interaction, every moment spent in the nursery wing of whatever residence housed them was a risk, not in the sense of immediate discovery, but in the cumulative sense of deepening a situation that was already architecturally impossible to sustain indefinitely. According to several accounts, those responsible for managing his schedule were aware of this and, in the language available to functionaries who could not speak directly, indicated as much. The emperor's response, in the versions that have survived, was consistent. He continued to go. In 1873, the same year that Olga was born, a decree was issued through channels that combined imperial authority with extraordinary discretion. It granted the children a legal identity under the surname Yuryevski, together with a formally protected status that placed them, in technical terms, outside the complete legal invisibility that had characterized their first years. The decree was not published. It was not announced through any official court communication. Its existence was not confirmed in any source accessible to the general public until historical researchers working through post-imperial archives encountered references to it long after the dynasty it had served had ceased to exist entirely. According to some accounts, even the small circle of court officials aware of its preparation did not receive full details of its contents. It was a document designed to accomplish something specific while leaving the smallest possible trace of having been created at all. What the Yuryevski decree represented was, in institutional terms,
a kind of legal parenthesis, a space carved inside the formal structure of imperial authority where 4 children could exist with some protection without requiring the court to publicly acknowledge the circumstances of their existence. It resolved nothing about their relationship to the dynasty. It clarified nothing about their futures. What it did was establish, at some level below official visibility, that their father had considered those futures and had used the tools available to him to address them in the only way the situation permitted. That the document required such extraordinary discretion to create was, of course, a measure of how completely the situation had moved beyond what the ordinary mechanisms of imperial life were equipped to handle. There is something in the image of those 4 children, housed in proximity to the throne of the largest empire on Earth, cared for by staff bound by the same institutional silence that pervaded every aspect of this story, named with a surname invented specifically to give them legal form without revealing its origin, that the dry language of historical reconstruction tends to flatten. They were not abstractions. They were not instruments of anyone's political calculation. They were children growing up inside a construction of concealment that the adults around them had built before any of them were born, and would continue maintaining long after the youngest arrived. Georgi and Olga and the brief life of Boris and the young Ekaterina existed at the center of something they had not chosen and could not yet understand. A private world that sat with extraordinary precariousness directly inside the most formal and carefully observed institution in Russia. The Russian imperial court in the 1870s was not a simple institution. It was a layered, competitive, deeply hierarchical environment in which rank determined everything. Who stood where during ceremonial occasions? Whose correspondence received immediate attention? Whose absence from a gathering was noted and interpreted? Whose signature appeared on which documents and in what order? Within this structure, disagreement could rarely be expressed directly. The tools available for registering disapproval were almost entirely indirect. The formal slight, the calculated absence, the letter that was slightly delayed, the endorsement that was withheld from a minor matter where withholding carried no practical consequence but sent a message legible to anyone fluent in the court's internal language. By the mid-1870s, according to several accounts preserved in aristocratic correspondence from the period, those tools were being used with increasing frequency.
The senior members of the Romanov family, brothers, cousins, and the wider network of relatives whose positions within the dynasty gave them both proximity to the emperor and a formal stake in the dynasty's standing, did not, as a rule, speak openly about what they understood to be happening. Open speech of that kind carried its own risks, and most of them were experienced enough in court life to know that the emperor's personal loyalties were not a subject that rewarded direct engagement. What they communicated instead was transmitted through the vocabulary of ceremony and protocol. Certain gatherings that would ordinarily have included senior family members were attended in noticeably reduced form. Some signatures that were customarily collected on documents of minor but visible significance were slower to arrive than convention required. Invitations to certain private occasions were accepted and then quietly not honored. Whether these gestures constituted a coordinated response or simply reflected a convergence of individual discomfort is something historians have debated without reaching a firm conclusion. Some who have examined the relevant correspondence suggest there were conversations, conducted in person, deliberately leaving no written trace, in which senior figures compared their assessments of the situation and arrived at broadly shared positions. Others argue the evidence supports nothing more organized than a general atmosphere of aristocratic disapproval expressing itself through the only channels available. What is less contested is the cumulative effect. By the middle of the decade, the internal social environment of the court had developed a quality of subdued but unmistakable tension that multiple independent observers from the period registered in terms remarkably consistent with each other. The concern being expressed, to the extent that it can be reconstructed from the surviving record, operated on more than one level simultaneously.
There was the matter of propriety, the straightforward aristocratic discomfort with a situation that violated the formal expectations of the dynasty's public identity. But there was something beneath this that appears, in the more candid accounts from the period, to have been more troubling than simple questions of decorum. By the mid-1870s, the political situation across the Russian Empire had entered a period of intensifying instability. Revolutionary organizations were becoming more organized, more ideologically coherent, and more willing to pursue violence as a method. Attempts on the lives of officials and public figures were no longer isolated incidents, but part of a recognizable and accelerating pattern. The government's response, increasingly reactive, internally divided, was generating its own anxieties among those whose positions depended on the continued authority of the imperial system. It was against this background that some among the court's senior figures reportedly began to raise, through the careful indirection available to them, a concern of a different order. The emperor's personal circumstances, in this version of the anxiety, were not merely a matter of internal family embarrassment. They were a variable in a much larger equation of institutional stability. A sovereign whose private life had become the organizing secret of his own household was, by definition, a sovereign whose authority was partly dependent on the continued cooperation of those who held that secret. His attention was divided. His decision-making existed within a personal context that those responsible for advising him could not officially acknowledge. And the loyalty of those closest to him, measured not in declarations but in the practical choices of daily proximity, had been shaped by years of involvement in something that could not be discussed openly. Some accounts from the period suggest that at least one senior official with access to the emperor attempted, with considerable delicacy, to raise the question of whether the current arrangement had become a liability at precisely the moment when the throne could least afford one. What is particularly striking about this period, examined from the distance of later history, is the way the personal and the political tracked each other so closely without, at least in any documented form, anyone in authority drawing the connection openly. The same years that saw the court fracturing along lines of private loyalty and dynastic disapproval were the years in which the revolutionary threat was becoming something that could no longer be managed through routine police methods. The organizations dedicated to bringing down the imperial system were not simply growing in number. They were, according to intelligence reports from the period, actively studying the structure of the court, its personnel, its rhythms, the gaps in its security arrangements. A court distracted by internal tension was, from the perspective of those studying it from outside, a court with fewer resources available for attention. Whether a direct causal connection between the internal fractures of the court and its deteriorating security situation can be established on the basis of available evidence is, to be precise about it, doubtful. The honest assessment is that the records do not support a clean argument of cause and effect. What they do support, with some consistency, is the conclusion that the two developments occupied the same space at the same time. That the court's energies were divided, that its internal coherence was under pressure, and that the people responsible for the emperor's safety were operating within an institution that was already consuming significant organizational attention on a problem it could not officially name. Some historians later suggested this was simply coincidence.
Others found the coincidence, examined carefully, rather too complete to leave entirely alone.
Maria Alexandrovna died on the 22nd of May, 1880, in the apartments she had occupied at the Winter Palace through years of progressive decline. She was 55 years old. The official cause recorded was the pulmonary condition that had been managing her existence for more than a decade, a diagnosis that surprised no one who had observed her deterioration through the 1870s and required no elaboration to be entirely credible. The court entered its formal period of mourning. The ceremonial machinery that handled such occasions in the Romanov household was activated with practiced efficiency. Notices were dispatched to the relevant European courts. The flags and the black crepe and the carefully staged public grief appeared in their expected places. From the outside, the death of an empress who had been visibly ill for years was, in institutional terms, a managed and orderly transition from one state of affairs to another. Inside the court, the atmosphere was more complicated. Several accounts from figures who were present in the imperial residences during the weeks immediately following the empress's death describe an environment of unusual suspension, a period in which the normal routines of court life continued at the surface while something beneath that surface was clearly being determined. Those closest to the emperor noted a quality in his behavior during these weeks that was difficult to categorize simply as grief. He was not, by the accounts available, a man visibly broken by the loss of a wife from whom he had long been personally estranged. Nor was he visibly indifferent. What those close to him observed was something more like a man in rapid motion toward a decision that had already been made, a man for whom the preceding period of mourning formality was a necessary passage rather than a genuine pause. The private marriage ceremony took place in early July of 1880. By some accounts, within 40 days of the Empress's death, though the precise date has been a subject of minor historical dispute, partly because the documentation surrounding it was managed with a discretion that has left the record thinner than one might expect for an event of this significance. The ceremony was conducted at Tsarskoye Selo. It was witnessed by a small number of individuals: the minister of the imperial court, a priest, and a handful of the most trusted members of the emperor's immediate circle. No wider announcement was made. No formal court notification was issued. The event existed, in terms of official visibility, in essentially the same condition that had defined everything connected to this relationship for the preceding 15 years: accomplished, real, and deliberately placed below the threshold of acknowledgement. The speed of the action was, by the consistent testimony of multiple sources, startling. Not because those who had long been close to the situation were unaware of the emperor's intentions. Several accounts suggest the morganatic marriage had been discussed in the indirect language available for such discussions for some years. What startled people was the interval. The Empress had been dead for weeks. The court was still formally in mourning. The ceremonial calendar of the dynasty had not yet absorbed the change in the household's composition, and the emperor had already, quietly and completely, replaced the structure that had sustained his private life for 15 years with something that bore the legal form, however limited in its practical implications, of a recognized union. The message transmitted by the timing was one that those receiving it found difficult to interpret without ambiguity. There were, broadly, two versions of the timing circulating within the court and among the aristocratic families connected to it.
The first was the charitable one. Alexander was aging, had been shaken by multiple attempts on his life, was aware that his personal situation could become legally and morally catastrophic for Ekaterina and the children if something happened to him without prior formalization, and had acted from a combination of genuine feeling and practical urgency that anyone with access to the full circumstances could understand, however uncomfortable the optics. This version found some sympathy among those who had been close enough to the emperor over the years to believe in the sincerity of what he felt. It acknowledged the speed while framing it as the natural result of a long-suppressed necessity finally finding its moment. The second version was harder, and it circulated more widely. According to this reading, the emperor had been waiting. Not passively, not without impatience, but waiting in the specific sense of a man who had identified the single external circumstance standing between his private life and formal legitimacy and had oriented himself toward its resolution for years. The Empress's death in this version was not simply a loss that freed him to act. It was the removal of the last institutional obstacle in a plan that had been fully formed long before the obstacle was removed. Those who held this view were not necessarily suggesting anything improper about the Empress's death itself. The historical record offers no credible basis for anything of that kind. What they were suggesting was something about the emperor's interior life during the years of her illness, that he had spent them not grieving in advance, but preparing, and that the 40 days between her death and his remarriage was not indecent haste, but the minimum interval that propriety absolutely required. Whatever version one finds more persuasive, the practical consequences of the marriage landed on the court with an impact that several accounts describe as immediate and palpable. A secret that had been maintained through 15 years of institutional effort had not simply been revealed. It had been elevated, given the legal form of a morganatic marriage, attached to a formal title, and made into something that the court was now required to acknowledge rather than manage in silence. The people who had spent years careful not to write certain things down, careful not to speak certain names in official contexts, careful to arrange corridors and schedules and documentation in ways that preserved the coherence of a fiction, those people now found that the fiction had been replaced, without their input and with extraordinary speed, by a formal reality. The machinery built for concealment had been rendered, almost overnight, redundant. Among the senior figures of the Romanov family, the reaction moved through channels that were by now familiar, indirect, formal, communicated through the vocabulary of ceremony and protocol rather than open confrontation. But the intensity was noticeably greater than what the preceding years of quiet friction had produced. Some accounts from aristocratic correspondence of the period describe a response that went beyond the calculated coolness of earlier years into something closer to genuine alarm,
not about the marriage itself in isolation, but about what it suggested regarding the emperor's judgment at a moment when the external threats to the dynasty were pressing with considerable force. The attempt on his life in February of 1880 had already demonstrated that those threats were not theoretical. The emperor's response to this environment had been, from the perspective of those watching with concern, to make himself and his court more internally complicated rather than less.
That combination of external danger and internal disruption was, according to more than one account from the period, precisely what made the weeks following the marriage feel to those living inside it less like a resolution than like the beginning of something they could not yet fully see. The title of Princess Yuryevskaya was granted by imperial decree in the weeks following the morganatic marriage, and with it came a formal elevation of the children's status. Georgi, Olga, and the young Ekaterina now carried a recognized name, a legal position, and the documented acknowledgement of their father's identity that had been withheld from them since birth. In purely technical terms, the decree was entirely within the emperor's authority to issue. The Russian imperial system, for all its procedural complexity, reserved to the sovereign a range of personal prerogatives that included the right to formalize domestic arrangements by decree when circumstances required it. Alexander had used that authority deliberately, completely, and with the same speed that had characterized every action he took in the months following the Empress's death. The question was not whether the decree was legal. The question was what it meant for everyone who now had to live with it. Within the Romanov family, the response moved along a spectrum that surviving correspondence from the period describes with some consistency. At one end, there was cold formality, the precise, correct, and entirely hollow acknowledgement that the situation existed, expressed through channels that communicated acceptance of the legal fact while withholding any suggestion of personal acceptance of the reality behind it. At the other end, there was something that several accounts characterize with language suggesting barely managed anger. Reactions communicated through trusted intermediaries, through the register of private letters that were written with the understanding they would not be preserved, and through the behavior of individuals at court functions where the new title created unavoidable questions of precedence and acknowledgement that no one had prepared a protocol for answering. The gap between the legal reality the decree had created and the social reality the court was capable of absorbing was, in the autumn of 1880, very wide indeed. The question of precedence was not a trivial one in an institution organized entirely around rank. Princess Yuryevskaya now held a title. She held it by imperial decree. The obligations of court etiquette toward a person holding such a title were, in principle, defined. But the individuals responsible for those obligations had spent the better part of 15 years carefully managing their relationship to her existence, maintaining the precise social distance required by a situation in which she had no formal position. The title did not simply change her status. It retroactively reclassified every act of managed distance that had been performed on her behalf and created a new set of requirements that those same individuals were now expected to fulfill with apparent naturalness. Some accounts from court figures during this period describe the resulting atmosphere as one of visible and uncomfortable recalibration. People determining, day by day, exactly how much acknowledgement the new situation required and how much their own positions would bear.
For the senior officials whose professional lives had been organized around the management of the dynasty's public stability, the shift carried implications that went beyond social awkwardness.
These were individuals who had made specific choices across specific years, choices about what to record and what to omit, what to present and what to conceal, how to manage the relationship between the visible court and the invisible arrangements that sustained it. Their complicity in the concealment had been, in a sense, a form of institutional loyalty, a judgment that the stability of the dynasty was better served by organized silence than by any of the alternatives available. The morganatic marriage and the title that followed it didn't simply end that silence. It reframed the entire preceding period as something other than what their choices had been intended to produce. The secret they had protected had become an official reality, and an official reality of a kind that required justification rather than concealment. The position they now occupied was, in several important respects, more exposed than the one they had occupied before. Some of these officials, according to accounts that surfaced years later through memoirs and the recollections of individuals adjacent to them at the time, responded by quietly reassessing where their institutional loyalties were most durably located. The emperor was aging. The attempts on his life had become a pattern serious enough that security around him had been substantially reorganized. The heir, Alexander Alexandrovich, the future Alexander III, held views on the morganatic marriage and the new title that had been communicated through every available indirect channel with perfect clarity. The future, in other words, had a direction that was legible to anyone reading the available evidence carefully. And officials who had built their careers on reading available evidence carefully were, in the autumn of 1880, doing precisely that. There is a version of these months, drawn from several independent accounts, in which the granting of the title produced something more than social friction and institutional recalculation. According to this version, the decree accelerated a quiet but consequential fragmentation of the loyalty networks that had sustained the emperor's inner circle for years. Some individuals whose positions had been predicated on proximity to Alexander, whose access, influence, and practical authority derived from the trust he placed in them, began the slow process of hedging that loyalty against the near certainty of a future in which it would be not only valueless, but potentially compromising. This is the kind of shift that does not announce itself. It happens through the gradual redirection of attention, through the slight but measurable change in the speed and thoroughness with which information reaches those who should receive it, through the almost imperceptible loosening of the bonds that make an institution function as a coherent whole rather than a collection of individuals managing their individual futures. Whether the security failures that would become catastrophically relevant in the following months were connected to this fragmentation is a question the historical record allows but does not confirm. What the record does show is that the months between the granting of the title and the assassination of Alexander II in March of 1881 were months in which the emperor's inner circle was operating in a condition of internal displacement, adjusting to a new reality that had been imposed with speed and without consultation, recalculating loyalties in the light of a future that was increasingly visible, and managing an institution that had been organized around a secret now replaced by a formal acknowledgement that created more complications than the secret itself had done. The title that could not be accepted was not simply a social inconvenience.
It was a marker of the precise moment at which the concealment that had held the court together for 15 years finally ceased to perform the function for which it had been built. Alexander Alexandrovich, the Tsarevich and heir to the Russian throne, was not a man given to ambiguity. Those who knew him during the 1870s and 1880s described a figure of considerable physical presence and equally considerable personal certainty. Someone whose views formed with conviction and remained, once formed, largely resistant to revision. He was conservative in his political instincts in ways that placed him at a measurable distance from his father's reforming temperament, and that distance was not merely ideological. It was generational, personal, and, by the time of the morganatic marriage and the granting of the Yuryevski title, freighted with a quality of accumulated tension that multiple accounts from the period describe as having become very difficult to contain within the formal registers available to a crown prince who could not openly confront a reigning emperor. The relationship between Alexander II and his heir had never been simple. Father and son disagreed on substantial matters of governance, and those disagreements had expressed themselves over the years through the kind of formal cordiality that functions in dynastic families as a precise substitute for genuine warmth. The Tsarevich had his own household, his own circle of advisors, his own developing sense of what the empire required and how it should be governed. His wife, Maria Feodorovna, the Danish princess who had become one of the most socially acute observers of the Romanov court, had her own clear assessments of the situation and communicated them through her husband and through the network of relationships she maintained with senior court figures. By the late 1870s, the household of the Tsarevich had developed into something with the character of a parallel court, a space where the dynasty's future was being quietly imagined in terms that differed from its present in several important respects. When the morganatic marriage became known within the inner circles of the family, and it became known almost immediately despite the discretion of the ceremony itself, the Tsarevich's response was, according to accounts that have survived through several indirect channels, one of controlled but unmistakable fury. He did not confront his father directly. There is no documented record of any open exchange between them on the subject that has survived in accessible form. What survived instead is the record of his reaction as it was communicated to those around him. In the register of private correspondence with Maria Feodorovna, in the accounts of individuals who moved between the two households and observed the change in atmosphere, and in the behavior of the Tsarevich himself at court occasions where the new situation created unavoidable moments of implicit acknowledgement. Several accounts describe him during this period as a man maintaining composure through visible effort. The concern that surfaced most insistently within the Tsarevich's circle during these months was not, at its core, simply a matter of personal offense or dynastic propriety. It was a concern about succession, and specifically about whether the emperor, having moved with such speed to formalize one set of arrangements, might not stop there. The morganatic marriage was legally clear on this point. Children born of such a union could not inherit the throne, and Ekaterina's new title carried no dynastic rights that could interfere with the established line of succession. The legal position was unambiguous. What was less unambiguous, according to several accounts from within the Tsarevich's circle,
was whether Alexander II intended to remain within those legal boundaries or would seek to use the same instrument, imperial decree, to alter them. Whether this fear was based on concrete evidence or was, at least in part, constructed by those whose interests were served by a Tsar-Liberator urgently threatened, is a question the available record does not cleanly resolve. There are accounts suggesting that specific individuals within Alexander Alexandrovich's circle actively encouraged the succession anxiety, framing the emperor's actions in terms designed to maximize alarm and thereby consolidate their own influence over the future czar. There are other accounts suggesting the fear was entirely self-generated, rooted in the simple observation that a man who had already done several things no one expected him to do was not predictable in his next steps. Both versions have the quality of partial truth. In the politics of dynastic succession, manufactured anxiety and genuine anxiety tend to arrive at the same behavioral destination by different routes. What is less disputed across the available sources is the practical effect of this period on the relationship between the emperor and his heir. The formal cordiality that had characterized their interactions for years had, by the autumn of 1880, acquired a new dimension, something that those observing it at close range described as moving beyond managed disagreement into something approaching mutual suspicion. The emperor, according to some accounts, was aware of the temperature of his son's response and found it both predictable and, in some respects that those who recorded these impressions found difficult to characterize precisely, painful. He had not sought his heir's approval for what he had done. He had not, by any surviving account, considered it necessary to seek it. But the gap that the marriage had opened, or widened, between them was not something he appeared able to treat with complete indifference. There is a version of the months between the morganatic marriage and the assassination in which the strained relationship between Alexander II and his heir forms part of a larger pattern of internal weakening. In this version, the emperor was a man who had used the autumn of 1880 to accomplish things he had long intended, and who had, in doing so, progressively narrowed the circle of people whose loyalty remained genuinely oriented toward him rather than toward the future he was not expected to inhabit for many more years. Some of those who had once served as bridges between the two courts, officials and figures whose usefulness depended on their access to both the present and the future sovereign, had by early 1881 repositioned themselves in ways that were subtle but legible to anyone watching carefully. The Tsarevich had not replaced his father, but he had become, for a growing number of people inside the court machinery, the more consequential address for their professional attention. Ekaterina Yuryevskaya was aware of this. Accounts from people who were close to her during these months describe a woman who tracked the political temperature of the court with the attentiveness of someone who understood that her own position and the positions of her children depended entirely on the continued personal authority of one man, a man whose hold on that authority was being tested simultaneously from outside by revolutionary violence and from inside by the very arrangements he had made to protect the people he loved. The shadow rivalry between the recognized family and the new one was not conducted openly. It was conducted through the language of the court, through the distances people maintained, the doors that were or were not open, the quality of the silences in rooms where both sets of interests were represented.
And it was conducted throughout with the awareness on all sides that the emperor's health and safety were the single variable on which everything else depended. Narodnaya Volya, the people's will, was not, by 1880, a new organization. It had emerged from the broader revolutionary movement of the 1870s through a process of radicalization that the imperial security apparatus had monitored with varying degrees of effectiveness and increasingly inadequate results. Its members were not, for the most part, the disorganized idealists that official characterizations of the revolutionary movement sometimes preferred to suggest. They were disciplined, operationally serious, and, most significantly, organized around a strategic decision that distinguished them from many of their predecessors: the targeted assassination of the Tsar himself, pursued with the explicit intention of destabilizing the imperial system at its apex. By the time of the morganatic marriage in the summer of 1880, this organization had already made multiple serious attempts on Alexander's life and had demonstrated a capacity for planning and persistence that the security services had consistently underestimated. The attempt of February 1880 deserves particular attention in this context. A bomb was detonated inside the Winter Palace itself, inside the dining room, timed for the emperor's dinner. Alexander survived only because a scheduling change altered his movements at the last moment. 11 soldiers died in the explosion.
The fact that the palace had been penetrated to that depth, that a revolutionary operative had been positioned close enough to the emperor's daily routine to plant an explosive device inside the building, was a security failure of a kind that should have produced, and did produce, immediate and thorough institutional response. A special commission was established. Security arrangements were reviewed. The relevant personnel were examined. The public record of this response is detailed and procedurally comprehensive. What is less fully documented is the internal atmosphere within which that response was being conducted. Officials who were involved in imperial protection during this period, in accounts that surfaced years later through memoirs and historical interviews, described a working environment of considerable complexity. The security services were attempting to reconstruct their procedures, identify their failures, and implement new arrangements, all within an institution that was simultaneously managing the aftermath of the Empress's death, the shock of the morganatic marriage, the distribution of the Yuryevski title, and the progressive fragmentation of the loyalty networks that had sustained the court's internal coherence. These were not separate tracks proceeding independently of each other. They were conditions of the same institutional environment, and the people responsible for security were not separate from that environment. They were embedded in it, subject to its tensions, and dependent on the cooperation of individuals whose attention and organizational energy were being divided in ways that nature court history. Some accounts from this period describe specific practical consequences of this division.
Communication between different branches of the security apparatus, the various departments responsible for different aspects of imperial protection, appears, according to several later testimonies, to have been less coordinated than the formal reorganization of early 1880 had intended. Information that should have moved quickly through defined channels was, in at least some documented instances, slower to arrive than the situation required. Whether this reflected deliberate withholding, ordinary institutional friction, or the simple effect of an organization attempting to restructure itself while continuing to function, is a question the available record does not resolve with precision. What it does suggest, with some consistency, is that the security environment around the emperor in the months following the morganatic marriage was less coherent in practice than it appeared on paper. The most contested interpretation in the historiography of this period is the suggestion that the internal court drama of 1880 created a form of institutional distraction that directly contributed to the security failures enabling the assassination. Historians who resist this interpretation point reasonably to the sophistication of Narodnaya Volya as an organization, arguing that it was capable of penetrating the emperor's security regardless of whatever internal tensions existed within the court, and that attributing its success to a distracted bureaucracy flatters the revolutionaries less than it diminishes the security services. This is a position with genuine evidential support. The organization had demonstrated its capabilities across multiple operations conducted during periods when the court was under no particular internal strain. Its eventual success did not require a specifically weakened opponent. But the alternative position, advanced by historians who have examined the institutional record in detail, does not require a simple causal argument to carry weight. It does not claim that the morganatic marriage caused the assassination. It claims something more limited and, in some respects, more troubling: that an institution already under external pressure became, in the months between July of 1880 and March of 1881, less able to direct its full organizational capacity toward that pressure because its internal resources were being partially consumed by a crisis of loyalty, legitimacy, and institutional coherence for which no formal mechanism existed. The difference between a fully coherent security apparatus and one operating with diminished internal alignment is not always visible in the formal record. It is visible in outcomes. What is perhaps most striking about this period, examined as a whole, is the way it concentrated so many forms of pressure into so short an interval. Within the space of roughly 9 months, from the Empress's death in May of 1880 to the assassination in March of 1881, the court had absorbed the morganatic marriage, the granting of the Yuryevski title, the deterioration of the relationship between the emperor and his heir, the progressive repositioning of loyalty networks within the palace, and the continuing operational campaign of an organization that had already demonstrated its ability to reach inside the Winter Palace itself. Each of these developments would have represented a significant demand on institutional attention in isolation. Together, they created a condition that several accounts from the period describe, in language that varies in its precision but converges on the same essential impression, as one of sustained and unrelieved strain. There is a detail from this period that appears in at least 2 independent accounts and has never been fully explained. In the weeks before the assassination, according to these accounts, specific intelligence regarding the activities of Narodnaya Volya operatives in St. Petersburg passed through the security apparatus and was reviewed by officials whose responsibility it was to act on such information. The action taken was, according to these same accounts, less than the intelligence appeared to warrant. The reasons for this, whether organizational, personal, or simply the result of the chronic underestimation that had characterized the security response to the revolutionary threat for years, are not established in any accessible record. but the accounts that describe it do so in terms that suggest, without stating directly, that the court's internal preoccupations were not entirely absent from the environment in which the decision was made. That suggestion, unproven and contested, has nevertheless persisted in the historical literature with the particular tenacity of claims that touch something real without being able to demonstrate it completely. The 1st of March, 1881 was a Sunday. Alexander II had attended a military review at the Mikhailovsky Manege in the morning and was returning along the Catherine Canal embankment in a closed carriage when the first bomb was thrown. The explosion damaged the carriage and wounded members of the escort, but left the emperor physically unharmed. He stepped out of the carriage, an action that those responsible for his security had specifically advised against in precisely this kind of situation, and moved toward the wounded. A second bomb was thrown at close range. The explosion tore through both legs and shattered the lower part of his body. He was carried back to the Winter Palace, where he died within the hour, surrounded by members of his family who had been summoned with the speed that the imperial household's emergency protocols allowed. He had not regained coherent consciousness. He was 62 years old.
Among those who reached the Winter Palace in the immediate aftermath was Ekaterina Yuryevskaya.
Accounts differ on the precise circumstances of her arrival and on exactly what she witnessed in the room where the emperor died. What the accounts agree on is that she was present, and that her presence in that room, in the formal space of dynastic grief, surrounded by Romanov family members whose feelings toward her ranged from cold tolerance to active hostility, represented, in the language of the court's internal politics, a final and irreversible collision between the two worlds that had coexisted with such difficulty for 15 years. The emperor who had constructed and protected the space she occupied was gone. What that meant for her position was not a question that required extended reflection from anyone in the room who understood how these transitions worked. The new emperor, Alexander III, assumed authority with the immediacy that the assassination demanded. His first decisions in the hours following his father's death were those of a man who had been preparing himself for the responsibilities of sovereignty and who now found those responsibilities arriving in the most violent and destabilizing form available. Security arrangements were reviewed and tightened with urgency. The revolutionary organization responsible for the assassination was to be pursued with the full resources of the imperial state. The court entered mourning. The ceremonial and administrative machinery of the transition from one reign to the next was activated. These were the visible, documented responses to an event that had shocked the empire and demanded immediate institutional action. They are what the formal record shows with clarity and detail. What the formal record shows with considerably less clarity is the parallel process that began, according to several accounts, within hours of Alexander II's death. A process directed not at the external threat, but at the internal arrangements his personal life had created. Ekaterina Yuryevskaya and her children occupied a specific legal position. She held the title of Princess Yuryevskaya by imperial decree, and the children held the surname and protected status that the Yuryevski Decree of 1873 and the subsequent formalizations had established. None of this was legally extinguished by the emperor's death. The decrees remained in force. The titles remained valid. What changed
was the institutional environment within which those legal facts existed, and within which, as those closest to the new emperor understood, they were now required to be managed in an entirely different way. The speed of what followed has been described by historians who have examined the period closely as notable in itself. Within days, some accounts suggest the process began within hours, Ekaterina and the children were effectively separated from the spaces they had occupied within the imperial residences. The departure was managed through channels that combined the formal authority of the new administration with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized the management of inconvenient realities throughout the preceding 15 years. No public announcement was made. No formal legal proceeding was initiated against her title or her children's status. The removal was accomplished not through confrontation, but through the gradual and thorough withdrawal of everything that had made residence in the imperial household practically possible. Access, staff, the informal infrastructure of proximity to power that the emperor had sustained through personal authority and personal will. What accompanied this removal, according to at least one account from an individual with access to the relevant spaces during the days immediately following the assassination, was a systematic gathering of documents, personal correspondence connected to the relationship, letters exchanged over years, private communications managed through the trusted intermediaries described in the records of the preceding decades, was, by this account, collected and secured in the hours and days following Alexander's death. The account describes this process as organized and deliberate, conducted by individuals whose authority to undertake it derived from the new administration and whose efficiency suggested prior consideration of exactly this contingency. The correspondence gathered in this process has never been confirmed to exist in any public archive. Whether it was destroyed, sealed in a restricted collection, or simply managed into an inaccessibility that functions in practical terms as destruction, cannot be established from any source currently available to researchers. The question of what those documents contained has circulated in the historiography with the persistent energy of questions that cannot be closed. Some historians have argued the correspondence was gathered purely for reasons of dynastic discretion, that the new emperor's concern was the protection of the Romanov name rather than the suppression of any specific content. Others have suggested, with varying degrees of caution, that the speed and thoroughness of the document collection implies the existence of material whose content was considered actively dangerous rather than merely embarrassing. A version circulating among researchers who have examined the archival gaps most carefully suggests that the correspondence included material connecting the private history of the relationship to specific decisions and specific individuals in ways that would have been, in the political atmosphere of the new reign, extraordinarily sensitive. None of these versions can be confirmed. None can be entirely dismissed. What can be established is that Ekaterina Yuryevskaya left Russia in 1882 and settled in Nice, where she would live for the remaining 4 decades of her life. She retained her title. She retained custody of her children. She received a financial settlement that was, by contemporary accounts, substantial enough to provide material security without suggesting any particular generosity on the part of the new administration. The settlement accomplished what such arrangements are designed to accomplish. It resolved the immediate practical question while removing the person in question from the field of institutional visibility. She was not prosecuted. She was not publicly dishonored. She was, with the efficiency of an institution that had spent 15 years learning how to make things disappear from the official record, simply no longer present. What the Winter Palace looked like in the weeks after her departure, whether the rooms that had been managed with such careful discretion showed any physical trace of the arrangements they had housed, whether the corridors used at unusual hours reverted immediately to ordinary patterns of use, whether the household staff, whose silence had been so carefully maintained, found the atmosphere different in any perceptible way once the secret they had protected was no longer in residence, is not something the available record describes. The palace continued. The court continued. The empire, for another 36 years, continued. What had existed within it for 15 years, and what had been so deliberately constructed to contain it, was absorbed into the same silence that had always been the institution's preferred response to whatever it could not openly acknowledge. Ekaterina Yuryevskaya lived until 1922. She died in Nice at the age of 74, having outlasted not only the emperor whose private world she had inhabited for 15 years, but the entire dynasty he had represented, the empire it had governed, and the social order within which every element of her extraordinary and impossible situation had been constructed and contained. She was alive when the last Romanov Tsar abdicated. She was alive when the dynasty that had removed her from its residences with such efficient speed was itself removed from history with considerably greater violence. Whether she found any particular meaning in that sequence of events, she did not record in any form accessible to later researchers. She had, by most accounts, become by her later years a woman of very deliberate silence. She did write. A memoir, or something approaching one, was worked on during her years in France. Fragments of it have been discussed in historical literature, though the full text, if it exists in complete form, has not surfaced in any publicly accessible archive. Those who have examined whatever portions are available describe a document that is, in the language of historical assessment, frustratingly selective. It addresses certain periods and certain relationships with some warmth and personal detail. It moves past others with a speed and brevity that suggests not absence of memory, but presence of decision. The years inside the court, the specific architecture of the arrangement, the names of the intermediaries, the content of the correspondence that was gathered and secured in the days following the assassination, are handled, according to those who have reviewed the relevant sections, with an economy of disclosure that tells you almost nothing while making it entirely clear that there was something to tell. What she chose not to write is, in its way, as revealing as anything she committed to paper. A woman who had lived at the center of one of the most consequential private arrangements in the history of the Russian Imperial Court, who had been present at its construction, its sustaining, its formalization, and its abrupt dismantling, possessed knowledge that historians working a century later could only approach through fragments, gaps, and the careful reading of absences. She could have written a document of extraordinary historical weight. She wrote instead something that preserved the essential habit of her entire adult life: the careful, deliberate, perfectly maintained silence around whatever it was most important not to say. The historical questions this story leaves open are not, it should be said, questions that time has accidentally failed to close. Some of them were closed deliberately,
by specific people, using the tools available to institutions that understand the value of controlled information. The correspondence, gathered in the hours after the assassination, has never appeared. The full memoir has never been confirmed. Certain palace records from the relevant period exist in forms that historians have described with careful professional language as incomplete in ways that do not appear to reflect ordinary archival attrition. These are not the gaps left by the passage of time.
They are, according to some who have examined them most carefully, the gaps left by decisions made at moments by specific individuals for reasons that were entirely legible to those making them. What remains when those gaps are mapped and the surviving evidence is read as carefully as it permits is a set of questions that organize themselves around a central unresolved tension. The relationship between Alexander II and Ekaterina Dolgorukova was, in its personal dimensions, a human attachment sustained over 15 years through circumstances of extraordinary difficulty and at considerable cost to nearly everyone within reach of it. That is one true thing about it, and it is not a small one. But it was also a political event, a sustained arrangement within the most consequential institution in Russia at a moment when that institution was under pressures it would ultimately not survive. And in that dimension, it generated consequences whose full shape has never been completely traced. Whether the affair undermined the dynasty is a question that admits no clean answer. The Romanov court had difficulties that had nothing to do with the private life of one emperor, and those difficulties would have pressed toward the same eventual outcome by whatever route history provided. But whether the court that faced the challenges of the 1880s was as coherent, as internally aligned, and as capable of the sustained institutional attention those challenges required as it would have been without 15 years of organized concealment, followed by the disruptive formalization of a hidden family, that is a different question and a more honest one. The honest answer is that the available evidence does not permit certainty. It permits, at most, the observation that the timing was what it was, that the internal fragmentation was real, and that the security failures were consequential. Ekaterina outlived all of it. She outlived the court that had accommodated and then expelled her, the dynasty that had given her children a name and then preferred to forget them, the empire that had been the backdrop against which everything in her life had occurred. She lived into a world so different from the one she had inhabited that the drawing rooms of the Winter Palace, the corridors managed at unusual hours, the rooms prepared without documentation, the intermediaries passing letters through chains of careful trust, must have seemed, in her final years in Nice, less like recent history than like the memory of a country that had ceased to exist, which, in every meaningful sense, it had. Whether the silence she maintained to the end protected something specific, a name, a fact, a version of events that would have altered the historical record in ways someone had reason to prevent, or whether it was simply the last expression of a habit formed so early and sustained so long that it had become indistinguishable from character, is the question that remains. It is the question this story, by the nature of what survives and what does not, cannot answer. And perhaps that is the most precisely accurate thing that can be said about it. Not that the truth has been lost, but that it was placed with great care and apparent deliberateness in a location from which it has not yet been retrieved. If this story left you with questions about the court, about the people inside it, and about the hidden forces that shaped the final years of the Romanov dynasty, then there are other narratives on this channel waiting to continue that thread. Each one approaches a different corner of the same world with the same care. Watch them and see what else the official record chose not to say. If you have a thought about what really drove Alexander II's decisions, or about what those missing documents might have contained, write it in the comments. These are precisely the conversations this kind of history deserves. And if this story held your attention, a like tells us it is worth continuing.